Imagine a massive group of people forced to share a single territory. They represent a vast spectrum of religious allegiances, wealth levels, and conflicting ideologies about how a society should function. Without a set of agreed-upon rules, the scenario creates immediate, pervasive insecurity. No one knows which property rights are valid, who possesses the authority to settle a dispute, or which actions will result in punishment. Human cooperation relies on a specific psychological threshold. Individuals only follow rules when they have a guaranteed assurance that everyone else is bound by them as well. This is the first core function of a constitution. It provides a set of publicly known, legally enforceable rules that achieve a minimal level of societal coordination. A constitution acts as the foundational mechanism of trust. It is the specific tool that allows a diverse population to coexist without living in constant fear of one another. Once a society agrees that rules are necessary, they must resolve a follow-up question. Who actually receives the authority to draft and enact those rules? This is the second function of a constitution. It explicitly maps out the distribution of power and defines the specific structure of the government. Democratic frameworks keep this decision-making power with the people. Other systems, however, have used their constitutions to strictly concentrate authority in a monarch or a single political party. To prevent the abuse of that authority, a constitution performs a third function, setting hard limits on government power. It protects citizens from arbitrary arrest and guarantees basic liberties like freedom of speech and association. Beyond setting limits, modern constitutions serve a fourth function, acting as an enabling engine for societal aspirations. They mandate that the government actively promote equality and create the conditions for a just society. A successful constitution operates as a carefully engineered paradox. It grants a government enough power to coordinate a nation, while securely caging that power to protect the rights of the individual. Translating these theoretical functions into reality for a post-colonial landscape of hundreds of millions was a massive logistical challenge. India met this challenge through the Constituent Assembly. Between 1946 and 1949, this body debated and drafted the physical framework of the new republic. The philosophical core of their work was the Objectives Resolution. It gave concrete form to the principles inherited from the long national struggle for freedom. This resolution established non-negotiable guarantees. Power would flow from the people. Economic justice would be secured, with ironclad safeguards for minorities. The Assembly was engaged in a profound act of social engineering. They were forging a unified national identity out of centuries of deep-seated divisions. Many constitutions fail shortly after they are written. They collapse because they rely on technical legality without ever earning the voluntary allegiance of their citizens. Survival depends on perceived fairness. If a document privileges one dominant group while stifling others, marginalized communities will eventually withdraw their compliance, and the system will disintegrate. The Indian Constitution masterfully distributed power across balanced institutions, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, ensuring no single group could subvert the system. This design provides security, yet remains flexible enough to evolve alongside the changing needs of the population. This flexibility allowed the 1949 framework to endure, guiding the legal and political reality of the modern Indian state. The authority of a constitution resides in its daily acceptance by millions of diverse people who choose to believe in its shared vision of justice. McCall Lalung was 23 years old when he was arrested and sent to a psychiatric hospital to await trial. Doctors successfully treated him and wrote to jail authorities declaring him fit for trial, but the system ignored the paperwork. He remained in judicial custody until age 77, losing 54 years of his life without a hearing. Contrast that total institutional failure with the 1982 Asian Games, a massive surge of national pride and modern infrastructure construction. The government hired contractors to build the stadiums and flyovers. Those contractors brought in thousands of impoverished workers, kept them in dismal conditions, and paid them well below the legally mandated minimum wage, a practice known as bigar, or forced labor. Look closely at both cases. What happens if McCall Lalung is a wealthy politician instead of a villager from Assam? Or if those construction workers were highly paid civil engineers? Do their rights evaporate so easily? This vulnerability is exactly why Part 3 of the Indian Constitution exists. It lays out the fundamental rights, which function like a legally enforceable warranty card for citizens. They guarantee specific protections against both private exploitation and the crushing weight of government overreach. To understand the power of these protections, you have to look at how they are anchored in law. A legislature can rewrite an ordinary legal right through the normal lawmaking process, but fundamental rights are guaranteed by the Constitution itself. They can only be altered through a formal amendment, putting them beyond the reach of a simple majority vote. Take the right to equality. It legally abolishes historical practices like untouchability and strictly forbids discrimination in accessing public spaces or employment based on religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. This leads to a common point of confusion. People often look at government policies like affirmative action or reservations in jobs and college admissions and assume they violate the principle of equality by favoring specific groups. But the Constitution explicitly addresses this in Article 16. It clarifies that reservations do not break the rules of equality. Instead, they correct a staggered starting line. True equality of opportunity requires active measures to offset deep social and educational inequalities, so everyone actually has a fair shot at the finish line. The highest tier of these protections is Article 21, the right to life and personal liberty. Under this provision, the state cannot deny citizens their personal liberty or arrest someone without explicitly telling them the grounds for that arrest. Police must present any arrested person to a magistrate within 24 hours. This specific safeguard completely failed Mashal Lalung, but there is a crucial caveat built into the system. As powerful as these fundamental rights are, they are not absolute. The government can impose reasonable restrictions on them. For example, the state can legally bypass that strict 24-hour rule using a tool called preventative detention. If the government determines an individual is a threat to public order or national security, it can imprison them for up to 3 months before an advisory board even reviews the case. That creates a massive point of friction. The Constitution demands the protection of personal liberty, but simultaneously equips the state with a tool that can easily be misused to detain citizens and silence dissent without an immediate trial. So, if the system can fail and the state holds these massive enforcement tools, how do the vulnerable actually fight back? Look back at the laborers who built the Asian Games infrastructure. A team of social scientists studied their conditions and filed a petition invoking the right against exploitation. They built a strict legal argument. Employing a person for less than the prescribed minimum wage legally constitutes forced labor. The argument held up. The court accepted the plea and issued a binding directive, forcing the government to ensure those thousands of workers received their rightful, fully prescribed wages. That victory was possible because of the judiciary. The rights listed in the Constitution mean nothing without an independent body to enforce them. The Supreme Court serves as that ultimate protector, holding the power to strike down executive and legislative actions that violate a citizen's rights. While the Constitution organizes the powers of government, the Bill of Rights defines the limits of those powers. It functions as a set of specific prohibitions, clear legal boundaries that specify exactly where the state's authority over the individual ends. We tend to assume that democratic elections are a straightforward translation. Millions of people cast their votes, the majority rules, and the resulting government accurately reflects the collective voice of the public. The 1984 Indian Lok Sabha election provides a massive stress test for that assumption. That year, the Indian National Congress Party secured an absolute supermajority, claiming 415 out of the 543 available seats in Parliament. This chart maps the disparity. Congress took 80% of the legislature, with only 48% of the popular vote. In contrast, the BJP captured 7.4% of the vote, but ended up with less than 1% of the seats, just 2 representatives. This disparity is the intended output of the specific mathematical algorithm governing how these ballots were counted. The 1984 data demonstrates that electoral math is inherently nonlinear, a translation that can turn a minority of votes into a supermajority of seats. The mechanism driving the 1984 result is called the first-past-the-post system, or the plurality system. In this model, the entire country is fractured geographically into 543 single-member constituencies. To win a seat, a candidate does not need to secure a mathematical majority of 50% plus 1. They only need a plurality. They simply have to cross the finish line before anyone else in that specific district. Imagine a localized race allowing one candidate to pull ahead. They can take total control of that district's seat with as little as 35% of the vote. That leaves 65% of the citizens in that district without any legislative representation. Their votes essentially evaporate from the final seat count. When you repeat that localized plurality victory across hundreds of isolated geographic districts, the leading party gains an exponential bonus in total seats. First past the post acts as an amplifier. It converts narrow, highly localized leads into massive national supermajorities. We can test an entirely different representation model by looking at Israel. They use proportional representation, an architecture that completely eliminates geographic voting districts. Under this system, citizens do not select a local candidate. They cast their vote for a centralized party list. The rule here is strictly linear. The percentage of the national vote a party secures exactly translates into the percentage of legislative seats they are awarded. In the 2015 Knesset elections, a coalition known as the Joint List secured 10.6% of the vote, guaranteeing them exactly 13 of the 120 seats. A third variant is the Single Transferable Vote, or STV. India uses this highly complex mathematical system for its upper house, the Rajya Sabha, to achieve proportionality through ranked voter preferences. STV strips away simple plurality entirely. Instead, this formula generates a rigid mathematical quota that a candidate must clear to earn a seat. Both proportional representation and STV are explicitly programmed to optimize for exact demographic reflection, completely avoiding the distortion built into first-past-the-post. If proportional representation is mathematically superior at reflecting the public, why did India's constitutional architects deliberately choose the distorted first-past-the-post system? Proportional representation has a severe systemic vulnerability. By perfectly reflecting every ideological niche in a vast country, it yields a highly fractured, multi-party legislature. Because no single party holds a mathematical majority, the executive branch is forced to rely on fragile, constantly shifting coalitions to govern. First-past-the-post sacrifices mathematical exactness for a specific engineering goal, manufacturing decisive single-party majorities. To win a local plurality, extreme political factions are forced to moderate and build broad coalitions before the election ever takes place. A constitution can be optimized for exact mathematical representation, or it can be optimized for executive stability. It cannot achieve both. Still, first-past-the-post has a critical flaw. It systemically silences historically oppressed communities who are too geographically dispersed to ever form a winning 35% plurality in any single area. The architects rejected the British-era solution of separate electorates, which isolated minority voters into entirely segregated voting pools. Instead, they built a constitutional patch, reserved constituencies, mapped out by an independent delimitation commission. Inside these specific zones, the voting base remains universal for all citizens, but the ballot itself is restricted exclusively to candidates from the marginalized group. Reserved constituencies act as an engineered spatial patch. They guarantee representation without abandoning the unifying architecture of the plurality system. When we look at the results of India's 1984 Lok Sabha, alongside the linear exactness of Israel's 2015 Knesset, the design principles become clear. The specific mathematical rules of the game dictate the ultimate outcome of the game. An election is never simply a passive mirror, perfectly reflecting the broader public opinion back at the state. Proportional systems are programmed to act as a flawless, fractured reflection of a fractured society. Plurality systems are explicitly programmed to compress those fractures, forcing cohesive governance and localized accountability. The mathematical architecture of a constitution programs the exact behavior and distribution of political power. Every formal organization, from a local school to a multinational bank, needs a group of people at the top to actually implement the rules and run the day-to-day operations. We call this the executive. When you look at national governments, the design of this executive branch changes drastically depending on where you are in the world. Take the United States. They operate on a presidential system. The president is both the head of state and the head of government, concentrating immense executive authority in a single, highly powerful individual. Compare that to a constitutional monarchy like the United Kingdom or Canada. The formal head of state is a monarch, but their role is largely ceremonial. They hold the title, but the prime minister and the cabinet yield the actual administrative power. How a country chooses to arrange these positions dictates how it defends itself against absolute, unchecked authority. When India wrote its constitution, the framers had a specific fear: the cult of personality. To prevent one leader from dominating the system, they engineered a parliamentary executive. They split the roles. The Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers run the government and hold the functional power, while the President serves as the formal head of state. But there is a legal mechanism that seems to strip the Indian President of all agency. Article 74 explicitly states there will be a Council of Ministers to aid and advise the President. An amendment added one heavy word: shall. The President shall act in accordance with such advice. This legally binds the President to obey. If the highest office in the land is constitutionally forced to sign off on whatever the Prime Minister decides, you have to ask, is the Indian President just a highly paid human rubber stamp? The short answer is no. The President acts as a constitutional safety valve, equipped with 3 distinct emergency levers. The first lever is the power of reconsideration. When the Council of Ministers sends up a decision, the President doesn't have to sign it blindly. If they spot legal flaws or feel the policy harms the country, they can send it right back and ask the Council to review it. There is a catch. If the Council ignores the warning, refuses to make changes, and sends the exact same advice back up, the President is then constitutionally required to accept it. That might look like a weakness, but it forces questionable government actions out into the open. A formal rejection from the head of state carries immense political weight. It acts as a massive public warning shot. The second lever is far quieter and much more dangerous. It's known as the pocket veto. Every bill passed by Parliament must receive the President's signature before it can become law. But if you read the Constitution closely, you'll notice a massive loophole. It completely omits a time limit for when the President has to sign. We can see this in action by looking at 1986. Parliament passed the Indian Post Office Amendment Bill, a piece of legislation widely criticized for giving the government powers to intercept mail and threaten the freedom of the press. The bill reached President Gyani Zail Singh. He didn't reject or return it. He made no decision on it for his entire remaining term. By the time his presidency ended and a new president took over, the political landscape shifted. A new government came into power in 1989, and they completely abandoned the legislation. By utilizing the pocket veto, the president proved they possessed the power to silently assassinate a dangerous law, simply by weaponizing absolute inaction. The third discretionary lever is the ultimate one. It stays locked away during normal operations and only activates during moments of intense political chaos. Under normal circumstances, a political party wins a clear majority in the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament, and the president's job of appointing their leader as prime minister is a mere formality. But elections are highly competitive. Sometimes the voters deliver a fractured mandate, resulting in a hung parliament, where no single party commands a clear majority. This chart shows the electoral results from 1989 to 1998. Across 4 separate parliamentary elections during this period, no single party or pre-election coalition could cross the required threshold to form a government. With multiple leaders claiming they have the numbers to rule, the president steps out of the observer role. They become an active referee. They have to use their own judgment to evaluate the alliances and decide which leader can actually assemble and maintain a viable government. In these moments of democratic vulnerability, the allegedly ceremonial head of state suddenly becomes the single most powerful decision-maker in the nation. We started with a paradox: the strict binding text of Article 74 set against the reality of these 3 hidden discretionary powers. The architects of the Constitution knew exactly what they were doing. Jawaharlal Nehru explicitly argued against creating a mere figurehead, stating the Constitution wanted a head that neither reigns nor governs, but one that occupies a position of authority and dignity. By having the president elected indirectly by state and national representatives, the office is kept isolated from the daily turbulence of partisan politics. Yet the discretionary powers ensure the office remains armed for emergencies. India engineered an executive branch where functional power flows rapidly during times of stability. But the moment an administration tries to abuse that system, they suddenly hit a deliberately designed brick wall. When most of us think about a parliament or legislature, we picture a massive legislative factory. We assume it is the exact place where politicians sit around, write bills, and debate the precise phrasing of clauses, and eventually manufacture the laws we all live by. The day-to-day reality of how laws are made looks quite different. In India, like many parliamentary democracies, the actual drafting process happens behind the scenes. The executive cabinet decides the policy agenda, and bureaucrats write the text of the major bills under the supervision of a minister. Even if an independent member manages to draft and introduce their own bill, it has virtually zero chance of passing unless the ruling government actively decides to support it. If the prime minister and the cabinet are the ones actually writing the policies and deciding what gets voted on, what is the legislature doing? Are these elaborate chambers essentially just expensive rubber stamps for the executive branch? This dynamic has led political critics to argue that parliaments across democracies are in severe decline, entirely overshadowed by the overwhelming power of the executive. Removing the legislature changes the nature of the government itself. Lawmaking is only one function of these bodies. Their existence creates a specific set of structural constraints that dictate how executive power is actually used. The primary function of a legislature is oversight. It operates as a real-time accountability engine, ensuring that the executive branch has to continually answer to the public that elected them. To see how much bite this accountability has, we can look at a specific policy clash from 1998 over something as ordinary as urea fertilizer. That year, India's finance minister, Yashwant Sinha, used his budget proposal to announce a hike in the price of urea, 50 paise per kilogram. The goal was simple: reduce the massive government subsidy on the product. The response from the legislature was immediate and intense. The opposition staged a coordinated walkout. For 2 days, the Lok Sabha, the lower house, was rocked by acrimonious scenes and fierce debates, completely stalling the government's agenda. The pressure worked. The finance minister was forced to roll back the price increase entirely. 4 years later, in 2002, a similar attempt to raise fertilizer prices met the exact same fate under fierce opposition pressure. When you watch the news, actions like mass walkouts, unanimous protests, and suspended business look like political chaos. This is the literal friction of democracy at work. It is the physical mechanism that stops a government from taking unilateral action. This friction extends directly to the government's wallet through what is known as the financial function. While the executive branch is responsible for deciding how to spend money, they don't actually hold the purse strings. The government cannot collect a single new tax or spend a penny of public funds without explicit, formal approval from the legislature. To make sure this massive financial and legislative power is carefully managed, India relies on a structural safeguard, a bicameral legislature. Having 2 separate houses forces a double check on every single executive decision. The first is the Lok Sabha, or the House of the People. The members sitting in this chamber are elected directly by the voting public, representing territorial constituencies across the entire country. The second house is the Rajya Sabha, the Council of States. Instead of direct elections, members here are elected indirectly by state legislatures, giving each individual state a dedicated voice at the national level. The way those state voices are balanced is crucial. In the United States Senate, representation is symmetrical. Every single state gets exactly 2 senators and equal voting power, regardless of how many people actually live there. Take a look at this map comparing the states of Uttar Pradesh and Sikkim. If India used the American system, Sikkim's population of roughly 600,000 would have the exact same legislative power as Uttar Pradesh's nearly 200 million residents. As this chart illustrates, India's constitution prevents that discrepancy by weighting the representation. The system guarantees Sikkim one seat, so they are always at the table, but scales Uttar Pradesh up to 31 seats, so their massive population has a proportional say. This deliberate architectural design guarantees that every policy or budget is debated and scrutinized twice. It protects regional interest while ensuring that tiny geographical areas cannot disproportionately block the will of the broader population. Lawmaking is only one part of the legislative process. The parliament functions as an open forum for democratic debate, acts as the absolute gatekeeper for the nation's finances, and serves as a multi-layered filter balancing the needs of vastly different geographic regions. Even the most powerful prime minister, backed by a massive electoral majority and a strong cabinet, cannot bypass this building. They are legally required to face the members, answer their questions, and justify their actions to the public's representatives. The strength of a representative democracy rests on the structural power to scrutinize, challenge, and approve rules on behalf of the public. In a democratic society, the rule of law serves as the baseline equalizer. Every individual and entity is theoretically subjected to the exact same boundaries, but friction is inevitable. Private citizens will inevitably clash with one another, and more critically, citizens will clash with the state itself. To settle these disputes without the system fracturing into a dictatorship, you need an ultimate impartial referee. This creates a structural paradox. How do you grant a branch of the government the authority to police the rest of the government without the ruling party simply controlling it? The solution is absolute independence of the judiciary. This requires strict operational parameters. The other branches cannot restrain the court's functioning. They cannot interfere in its decisions, and judges must operate entirely free of fear or favor. The Indian Constitution secures this not through theoretical promises, but through a highly engineered physical architecture of isolation. To understand how the Indian courts wield their immense power today, we have to examine the specific structural barriers they built. We have to start by looking at the physical structure of the courts themselves. The Constitution establishes a single, integrated judicial system. Unlike some federal systems where states operate entirely separate networks of courts, India's judiciary functions as one singular, interconnected hierarchy. It operates as a strict pyramid. You have the subordinate and district courts at the base, the high courts sitting above them for each state, and capping the entire structure is the Supreme Court. Power and authority flow directly downward. The Supreme Court exercises absolute superintendence, its rulings mathematically binding on every court below. In reverse, the appellate structure acts as a funnel. Cases from local districts move steadily up the chain, eventually reaching that singular apex. This unified pyramid ensures the supremacy of law is standard across the entire subcontinent. It also means that whoever controls the top of the pyramid commands immense strategic value. Because of that concentrated authority, the framers equipped the judiciary with 3 specific constitutional shields to block political interference. The first shield is financial independence. A judge's salary and allowances are explicitly detached from legislative approval. Parliament cannot use the state budget as leverage to bankrupt a judge into compliance. The second shield is operational immunity. By law, the legislature is constitutionally barred from debating the conduct of judges during their normal parliamentary sessions. If politicians or private actors attempt unfair personal criticism to sway a ruling, the judiciary can trigger an active defense mechanism, contempt of court. Judges hold the unilateral power to penalize anyone who attempts to interfere. The final shield is security of tenure. Judges serve until a legally mandated retirement age. The executive branch lacks the power to arbitrarily fire them for rendering an unfavorable decision. By isolating money, speech, and time, the Constitution severs the standard levers of pressure that the government uses to control other public servants. But there is a glaring vulnerability at the start of the timeline. If the executive branch appoints the judges, their specific political philosophy will dictate how the Constitution is interpreted. For decades, the system operated on a simple baseline convention. The senior-most judge on the Supreme Court was automatically elevated to Chief Justice. The government explicitly broke this convention twice, superseding senior judges in 1973 and 1975 to appoint preferred candidates. Between 1982 and 1998, the judiciary developed a countermeasure. Through a series of rulings, the court shifted the Chief Justice's role from purely consultative to a binding recommendation. They established the principle of collegiality, commonly known as the collegium. In practice, the Chief Justice must consult with the 4 senior-most judges of the court. Together, they form a unified block before sending any recommendation to the executive branch. This mechanism structurally dilutes the political influence of the Council of Ministers. It creates a closed, self-regulating intake valve for the nation's highest courts. If judges are financially autonomous, immune from criticism, and select their own successors, how do you punish corruption? The constitutional standard for removing a judge is incredibly narrow. It is strictly limited to cases of proven misbehavior or incapacity. The ultimate stress test of this failsafe happened in 1991 with the attempted removal of Supreme Court Justice V. Ramaswamy. A high-profile inquiry commission found him explicitly guilty of willful misuse of office and moral turpitude regarding public funds. However, removing him meant clearing a mathematical barrier known as a special majority. A removal motion requires 2 distinct things to pass. First, 2/3 of the members present and voting. On the day of the vote, the motion easily cleared the 2/3 threshold of those sitting in the chamber, but the ruling Congress Party abstained from voting entirely. Due to that massive block of abstentions, the motion mathematically failed the second requirement of securing 1/2 of the total House strength. The judge remained. The system intentionally tolerates extreme friction when attempting to hold an individual accountable. It accepts this trade-off to guarantee the institution as a whole cannot be subjected to partisan witch hunts. This heavy defensive architecture serves a highly specific operational purpose. It exists entirely to enable the court to execute its massive constitutional powers. This diagram from the constitutional text maps the specific jurisdiction of the Supreme Court of India across 5 distinct domains. First is original jurisdiction. This gives the court the exclusive power to act as the primary ref states. Next is writ jurisdiction. The court holds the power to issue binding orders, like habeas corpus, directly against the state to restore an individual's fundamental rights. Beyond that, the court retains appellate power as the final word in civil and criminal cases, advisory power to counsel the president on public law, and the special leave power to intervene in any judgment from any court in the country. A court subjected to daily political pressure or threats of financial ruin could never survive executing these jurisdictions against the very state that funds it. That is why the Supreme Court of India operates today as one of the most powerful judicial bodies on the planet. This immense authority is the direct result of a deliberate, mathematical architecture of isolation, a system that traded immediate political accountability for the absolute preservation of the rule of law. Look at this political map of India right at the moment of independence in 1947. What you are seeing is a dense, irregular patchwork of massive British provinces, forced together with hundreds of distinct, semi-autonomous princely states, especially in the Rajputana and Central India regions. Now look at this map showing the same nation 70 years later. The internal boundaries have been almost entirely erased and redrawn. Massive territories were split apart, merged, and given entirely new names to create modern states like Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu. Normally, when a nation's internal geography changes this drastically, you are looking at the symptoms of a civil war or extreme state collapse. When highly centralized governments try to manage massive, diverse populations from a single point, they often break under the strain. The Soviet Union dissolved into several independent countries because a single region, Russia, attempted to dominate the languages and cultures of distinct areas like Uzbekistan. Yugoslavia met a similar fate, splitting apart completely when ethnic tensions and resentment could no longer be contained by a single central authority. India survived these exact same pressures of immense diversity and regional differences without violently fracturing. The country managed this by organizing its government through an accommodating structural mechanism known as federalism. At its core, federalism is a system that allows 2 distinct levels of government to operate over the exact same physical space. The first level is the national or central government. It is granted jurisdiction over subjects that affect the entire country as a unified whole. This means overarching necessities like military defense, international treaties, and printing a single national currency are handled from one place. The second level operates locally. Down at the state level, regional governments have the autonomy to manage their own day-to-day administrative affairs, maintain regional infrastructure, and govern in their local languages without asking the center for permission. Because of this split, citizens legally carry a dual identity. A person can be fiercely proud to be a Gujarati or a Jharkhandi, while simultaneously holding deep loyalty to the Indian nation. They are not forced to choose one over the other. Granting regions authority over their own distinct cultures acts as a pressure valve. It allows communities to govern themselves in the ways that matter most to them, preventing local frustrations from boiling over into a national rebellion. But this design creates an immediate logistical problem. If a massive central government and a smaller regional government are operating in the same territory, how do you prevent the central authority from simply overpowering the states and taking total control? The solution relies on a written constitution. In a federal system, this document acts as the supreme rulebook. It explicitly defines the division of power, ensuring that the central government cannot casually rewrite the rules to diminish the authority of the states. Even with the most detailed rulebook, having two levels of government passing laws means that overlapping claims and boundary disputes are inevitable. To resolve these conflicts, federalism requires an independent judiciary. Courts serve as the mandatory referee, holding the sole legal authority to interpret the Constitution and settle disputes between the center and the states over who truly holds the power in a given situation. However, mechanical rules and referees alone guarantee nothing. In 1958, the Federation of the West Indies was formed with a constitutional structure. 4 years later, it dissolved entirely because the independent island units viewed each other as economic competitors and simply refused to cooperate. A federal constitution is merely a paper blueprint. For the system to actually survive, the political culture driving it must rely heavily on mutual trust, a willingness to compromise, and respect for regional differences. Look at the modern political map of India one more time. Viewed through the lens of federalism, the massive geographical changes since 1947 aren't symptoms of a fractured state. They are the constitutional machinery working as intended. Over 70 years, the central government continually reorganized the internal map to accommodate the specific linguistic and cultural demands of the people living there. As local identities strengthened, the borders were adjusted to match them. If the central government had refused to alter the map and instead forced a single, dominant national identity on its population, the resulting regional resentment would have likely torn the country to pieces. This is where rigid federations fail. By refusing to adapt to internal pressures, they break. Systems that bend under stress are the ones that survive. A successful federal democracy is not defined by a permanent set of borders. It operates as a living organism, deriving its actual strength from its flexibility to continuously negotiate unity across deep divisions. In 1997, the state government of Tamil Nadu wanted 2 hectares of land in the rural village of Vengavassal. The district collector, a powerful state authority, ordered the local village council and its female president to sign the land over. The village council said no. So the collector ignored them and issued an order to acquire the land by force. Instead of backing down, the rural council filed a lawsuit, taking the state government all the way to the Madras High Court. The final ruling from the division bench shocked the local establishment. The judges blocked the state's acquisition, declaring that the collector's actions were a gross violation of the local council's constitutional rights. A tiny rural community legally humiliated a powerful state bureaucracy. To understand how a local village acquired that kind of constitutional firepower, we have to look back at the origins of the Indian Republic. You might assume that the architects of the world's largest democracy wanted to distribute political power to the masses right from the start. Mahatma Gandhi certainly did. He envisioned a nation built entirely on autonomous, self-sustaining communities, famously calling them village republics. For him, true independence meant pushing decision-making and administrative control all the way down to the very bottom of society. Yet, despite his immense influence, that vision was largely ignored. The other founding figures of modern India were actually terrified of local governance, and they made deliberate choices to suppress it. When the Constituent Assembly gathered to draft the new legal framework, the room became a battleground over where the nation's power should be concentrated. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru strongly opposed pushing authority down to the rural level. He wanted a powerful, unified central government. The country had recently suffered the chaotic trauma and geographic fracture of the partition. Nehru viewed extreme localism as a direct threat to the fragile unity of the new nation. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar brought an even harsher sociological critique to the debate over empowering local communities. He warned the assembly that rural villages were not the democratic utopias Gandhi imagined. Instead, he argued they were deeply unequal environments, defined by strict hierarchies, factionalism, and the rigid constraints of the caste system. Driven by these fears, the assembly made a compromise. Local government was stripped of real executive authority and relegated to the directive principles of state policy, meaning it was included as an advisory suggestion, but carried zero legal weight. For the next 40 years, that lack of constitutional armor had severe practical consequences for the country's development. This timeline charts the systemic decline over those decades. State governments consistently withheld financial assistance. They delayed local elections for years at a time and routinely dissolved elected boards entirely, handing control directly over to government officers. The breaking point came in 1989. After an extensive review, the Thungan Committee concluded that top-down national development was failing. Economic progress was impossible without actual local involvement. The solution arrived a few years later with the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments. These laws finally provided local bodies with mandated periodic elections, a clear list of civic functions, and guaranteed funding. The 1993 amendments transferred legal sovereignty directly to the grassroots, mandating that power and funding be shared with the very bottom of the democratic pyramid. But what about Dr. Ambedkar's warning? Did handing legal authority to the villages simply empower wealthy upper caste men to solidify their traditional control? Look at the story of Geeta Rathore from a village in Madhya Pradesh. In 1995, she ran for the position of Sarpanch, or village president, and won. Her initial victory was made possible because the 1993 amendments instituted reserved seats. This system was explicitly designed to break traditional power monopolies, ensuring that women and marginalized groups had a guaranteed space in local decision-making. Once in office, Geeta leveraged her new constitutional authority. She renovated the community's water tanks, built a school, constructed new roads, and actively organized the village to fight against domestic violence. In 2000, she was re-elected from a non-reserved seat. By rewarding her performance as a leader, the community showed that mandated representation had opened a path for new voices to gain authority based on merit. National politics, debated in large capitals, often deals in abstract policies and broad economic targets. Local governance handles the immediate, daily stakes of ordinary life. Village councils provide efficient, cost-effective solutions because they operate on intimate local knowledge rather than top-down assumptions. The 1993 reforms didn't solve every problem, but they created a more direct form of accountability, ensuring that for millions, democracy is a daily local practice rather than a distant national abstract. The United States Constitution has governed for over 2 centuries, yet in that time it has been amended just 27 times. India's constitution is far younger, reaching its 74th year in 2024, but in that shorter window it has undergone 106 separate amendments. This data presents a logical problem. Does such a high volume of edits suggest the document was flawed from the start, or that the system itself is unstable? To understand the stability of the world's largest democracy, we have to look past the number and look at the nature of these changes. If we map these amendments over time, we see a steady, ongoing process rather than a single period of chaos. There was a significant surge between 1970 and 1990, a period largely defined by the dominance of a single political party. Yet 10 amendments were passed in just 3 years, between 2001 and 2003, an era of fractured coalition politics and intense party rivalries. Regardless of who holds power or the size of their majority, The stream of constitutional change has remained constant. These edits are not a temporary reaction to political turmoil. They appear to be a permanent, functional part of the system. History shows that when a constitution cannot adapt, it often collapses. In its 74-year lifespan, the Soviet Union went through 4 entirely different constitutions. France has seen even more upheaval, rewriting its foundational text multiple times to form 5 different republics over the last 2 centuries. Those documents were often too rigid to absorb the shocks of political change or evolving social ideas. When the pressure became too great, they broke. India's framers took a different path. They designed what they called a living document, a text intended to balance sacred principles with the flexibility needed to survive the future. By allowing the Constitution to bend, they ensured the national framework would not shatter under the weight of time. The mechanism for this survival is Article 368. It creates a tiered system of amendment, setting different levels of difficulty depending on what is being changed. For routine administrative tasks, like adjusting state boundaries, the process is flexible, requiring only a simple majority in Parliament. But for changes to the core of the document, the hurdle becomes much higher, requiring a special majority. This means at least 50% of the total House must support the bill, and 2/3 of those present and voting must also agree. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar argued that this specific mathematical requirement ensures that any major change reflects a broad public consensus rather than the whims of a temporary majority. For changes that affect the balance of power between the states and the center, the requirement is even steeper: a special majority plus the consent of half of all state legislatures. This structure allows the government to resolve technical errors easily while making the core principles resistant to partisan tampering. This tiered system explains the high count of 106 amendments. The vast majority of these edits are technical. For example, the 15th Amendment was passed simply to increase the retirement age of high court judges from 60 to 62. Other edits are administrative requirements, such as the periodic extensions of legislative reservations for scheduled castes and tribes, which must be renewed every decade to maintain fair representation. The high number of amendments isn't a sign of constitutional failure, but evidence of a system performing the regular maintenance required to keep it functional. Without these 106 updates, the Indian Constitution would likely have become disconnected from modern reality and faced collapse. It is a mistake to view a constitution as an unalterable stone tablet. It functions more like the operating system of a democracy, a foundational code that requires continuous optimization and patches to run effectively as the world changes. After 74 years, the Indian Constitution remains the framework for the nation, precisely because it was designed with the capacity to evolve. We usually imagine a constitution as a static set of rules, a collection of laws that exists mainly to tell politicians what they aren't allowed to do. But the grim reality is that modern states possess a complete and total monopoly over absolute force and coercion. When this machinery of state power is occupied by those who would abuse it, the institutions meant for our well-being can turn into instruments that harm the interests of individuals and groups. A constitution provides the basic rules of the game to prevent this, acting as a continuous check to ensure the state does not tyrannical. For a nation emerging from the shadow of the British Empire, this challenge was even more complex. They inherited a society where traditional social hierarchies were already deeply entrenched. In an environment defined by such deep inequality, simply keeping the government from interfering would only preserve those old, unfair power structures. The framers realized that to fix a broken society, they had to go beyond mere restriction. They needed to actively use state power to dismantle those hierarchies. Their task was to design a paradoxical system, one that simultaneously shielded the individual from state abuse while empowering the state to drive a radical social transformation. Constitutions are not created in a vacuum. They carry specific genetic markers of the era and the struggles that brought them into being. Japan's 1947 Peace Constitution is a clear example. Article 9 explicitly renounces war as a sovereign right, an engineering choice made specifically in response to the trauma of World War II. In India, the primary trauma was colonial subjugation. The Constitution had to serve as a declaration of full self-determination, drafted entirely by elected representatives without external interference. Jawaharlal Nehru described the Constituent Assembly as a nation on the move, a body tasked with throwing away the shell of its past to fashion a new garment of its own making. The first mechanism of this blueprint is the shield. Its purpose is to strictly limit the exercise of state power over the individual. These legal restrictions were the product of over a century of continuous political and intellectual activity. Early in the 19th century, Ram Mohan Roy protested the British state's curtailment of the press, arguing that a responsive state must provide citizens the means to communicate their needs. This demand for liberty was maintained by generations of Indians throughout British rule, eventually hardening those century-old protests into the literal legal protections we use today. The second mechanism is called the sword. This part of the blueprint provides vulnerable people with the power to achieve collective good and claim the rights they were traditionally denied. This engine was designed to break traditional social hierarchies, using the state to lift up groups history had pushed down. We see this in action through laws prohibiting discrimination based on religion or language, provisions existing because society values equality. The written laws are the visible expression of a deeper moral vision, one committed to egalitarianism and social justice. Today, these foundational ideals are frequently contested, discussed, and sometimes manipulated for short-term partisan gain in our legislatures and our press. Because the system has worked for so long, we have begun to take our legal and political practices for granted, letting the reasons behind them slip into the background of our consciousness. This forgetting becomes dangerous when those practices are challenged. Without a grasp of the underlying principles, the entire system becomes difficult to defend. To resolve modern conflicts over these values, we have to look past the surface and arbitrate based on the Constitution's underlying political philosophy. Grasping the meaning of current constitutional practices requires us to go back in time, revisiting the concerns of those who originally framed the document. We must read the text alongside the Constituent Assembly debates to find the justifications for our embedded laws. These debates reveal a philosophy that is liberal, secular, and sensitive to the needs of minorities and historically disadvantaged groups. The Indian Constitution remains a living political philosophy. Our current rights and struggles are a direct continuation of the history that began in that room.